Hello, and thank you for tuning in. It's Michael Laxer from the Left Chapter, returning with the second of our The Left Chapter dispatches. Today, I wanted to take a look at what I think is the very disturbing sort of hypocrisy surrounding calls by our politicians for social distancing. I think most left-wing people, most progressives, and certainly most people on the socialist left absolutely agree that in this time of pandemic and in this time of the coronavirus crisis, that we need to practice the social distancing that our health officials and that our medical community are suggesting, and that that this needs to be done so that we can get out of this with the fewest number of people falling ill and with the fewest number of people, of course, dying. So, obviously, the sort of demented protests we're seeing in the United States by far right movements, encouraged by President Trump, are incredibly antisocial. And, we're not going to be defending here people who choose to flaunt the social distancing rules or to behave in antisocial ways. That's not something that obviously we would endorse or that is at all acceptable. It is incredibly important for our community, for our neighbors, for our friends and comrades, that we actually do listen to health officials and that we do maintain a proper social distancing and take other advice around things like masks, etc. The trouble, however, is that around all of the pleas from many of our politicians to maintain social distancing and around the crackdowns by municipal authorities, provincial authorities, with police and bylaw enforcement, often using draconian methods, very, very steep fines. Around all of this, there is a really pronounced cloud of what can only be called hypocrisy. The fact is that we still see large man camps open in provinces like British Columbia, working on Site C, for example. Quebec, on April 15th, recently just reopened all of their mines, which also have man camps associated with them, and pose a direct threat to local communities. All of these operations claim that they are going to be practicing social distancing internally, but it sort of beggars belief to think that this is really possible in a workplace that has hundreds of people working closely together and living closely together, eating closely together. It seems inconceivable that this doesn't pose a risk of coronavirus spread. And there's also the reality that enforcement of such sort of social distancing practices isn't equally applied. I mean, that's just the nature of our society. We are seeing absurd cases where homeless people have been ticketed in Hamilton, for example. There was an initial wave of it, and then again a report today on Tuesday, April 21st, about homeless people being ticketed for not practicing social distancing. The sort of headline in the Hamilton Spectator says it all. I can't pay it anyway. Why are Hamilton police ticketing homeless residents during the COVID-19 pandemic? It's a very good question. But the answer really comes down to the fact that historically policing in Canada, just as in the United States, hasn't fallen equally on all of our different communities. When we give police greater authority and when we empower wannabe cops, fake cops like bylaw officers, to sort of randomly ticket and harass people, give them very broad leeway to do so, as we are at the moment, inevitably it will fall. racialized, marginalized communities and people living in poverty will be targeted more than other communities are. And we're seeing that happen. Along with the example of Hamilton, there was an article that was released in The Conversation that also talks about how, when we're policing the pandemic, that this is going to hit the black community. It says public health has historically been an extension of policing for black people that has positioned us as suspicious and nefarious in our actions and movements. In our current state of emergency, this union of policing and public health has led to more black people being arrested, detained, and physically restrained in the name of public health protection. The current rules around movement put black people at risk, more vulnerable to intensified policing, including carding and street checks, when in public and potentially exposed to the virus at work. It's important for us to understand that. And as this article in The Conversation is pointing out, they're not even really collecting data around how the coronavirus is affecting different communities differently, which is outrageous and unacceptable. And there will be links to both the article in The Spectator and the one in The Conversation in the description on YouTube. So we have both the fact that, man camps and all of these different things are being allowed to continue to operate. In the case of Quebec, it wasn't just mines that were allowed to reopen on April 15th. There was also residential construction, landscaping firms, nurseries, garden centers, swimming pool businesses, which is, I just find particularly absurd. Meanwhile, Quebec has had some of the most exceptionally strict alleged social distancing actions in their cities and neighborhoods and parks. It's pretty hard to take our politicians seriously, or to think that they are serious about social distancing, when they have these glaring, sort of glaring discrepancies in how they want social distancing to be practiced. We are throwing millions of low-wage workers and other frontline workers right into the fire, right into the whole crucible of this pandemic. They work in conditions where genuinely practicing social distancing all day is virtually impossible. And yet we have continued with a fairly laissez-faire approach to allowing people to shop, to allowing people to go to things like the liquor store. We haven't done something like, say, only allow people to shop on days corresponding to their last name, broken up in certain ways, and obviously I understand that, some people who don't drive, I don't drive, for example, and I have, people with larger families, single parents, the elderly, they're not necessarily able to bulk shop in the same way that somebody with a car, or who is more affluent, or who lives by themselves, should really be able to stock up once a week. There's no reason for somebody with a vehicle living with one other person to need to shop, one or two other people to need to shop more than once a week. So we have to be cautious in our approach to this. But the reality is that if you're going to be, there was an example of a father and his kid getting an $880 fine in Oakville. When they weren't when they were in a park, they weren't anywhere near anybody. It's pretty hard to understand why that warrants an $880 fine. But you can have hundreds of workers working in very cramped conditions, or very difficult conditions by various communities, and you can at man camps, and you can have millions of workers working every day in retail, and not see that there's a contradiction here, and that this contradiction is problematic, that this contradiction undermines the whole purpose of social distancing, and that this contradiction clearly is there, that is happening, because the people in power, the Fords and the Legos and the Horgans of the world don't want to genuinely don't want to impact the economy in the way that you would have to have a shutdown that would flatten the curve, to use that term, more rapidly. They want to keep large sectors of the economy open, and this doing so is much more to the benefit of big business and international capital than it is to the benefit of people or workers. So I think that it's really important for us to understand that if we continue to undermine social distancing through political hypocrisy, and if we take draconian steps on the one hand while being completely laissez-faire and lapsadaisical on the other, this is neither a coherent approach to dealing with the capitalist coronavirus crisis, nor is it a fair one, nor is it a reasonable one. And in the long run, when the authorities behave in ways that are not fair, that seem hypocritical, and that seem arbitrary, public resistance to efforts will grow, and that is counterproductive. So I think we need a much more serious, much less laissez-faire approach, an approach that is much more centered around working people, the needs of workers, of people, and much less around, continuing to keep large sectors of the economy going in the interests of big business and capital. As I said, there are several articles related to this that we actually have published on the left chapter, including one that was Quebec reopens mines despite the concerns of the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec-Labrador. The mines were opened despite the objections of the Indigenous community in Quebec. We also have one about the hypocrisy of our leaders around social distancing and how it is reckless. And we have one about how police and bylaw harassment is not a coronavirus cure, and how it is often, this enforcement does not fall equally on different people in different sectors of society. So there will be links to all of those, in the YouTube description, as well as to the two other articles that I referred to. Okay, thanks very much, and we will talk in the future.